Hey guys, tonight we begin with something slightly less philosophical, though arguably just as complex. Viking sex. It was politics, power, and occasionally very public. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You're standing in a medieval European village, and the stench hits you like a physical wall. Unwashed bodies, rotting teeth, and what can only be described as agricultural aromatics. But wait, there's someone walking through this olfactory nightmare who actually smells decent? That's your Viking, and he's about to revolutionize your understanding of medieval hygiene. Let's get this out of the way immediately. The Vikings were cleaner than you've been told. No, not spa day clean, but by medieval standards, they were practically soap-scented angels. While much of Europe was busy pretending bathing was a sin or just inconvenient, the Norse were over there scrubbing themselves weekly, using actual soap made from animal fat and ash. It smelled earthy, probably, but compared to their unwashed neighbors, they were walking clouds of lavender and smugness. They combed their hair, trimmed their beards, filed their nails, and even carried grooming kits made from bone and iron. Imagine pulling up to a longhouse date with a carved comb, neat braids, and fresh breath. In an era where most people still had hay in their armpits, English monks noticed this disturbing hygiene trend and recorded it, bitterly. There's one infamous complaint from an Anglo-Saxon chronicler who basically whined that Viking men were too clean and thus unfairly attractive to local women. That's right, their official explanation for Viking success with the ladies was soap-based cheating. The monks weren't wrong, though. In a world that smelled like a compost bin, the guy who bathed once a week and knew how to braid his hair was basically a sex god. But this wasn't just vanity. In Viking society, personal hygiene had status implications. If you were a free man, you were expected to look like one, and that meant grooming. If you were unkempt, people assumed you were poor, enslaved, or worse, a lazy layabout who couldn't even comb out a single lice egg for his woman. Cleanliness also had ritual significance. Before feasts, before battles, before bedroom adventures, you washed. It wasn't just about removing dirt, it was about preparing yourself to be presentable to gods, ancestors, or your extremely discerning longhouse crush. Historians still argue whether this emphasis on cleanliness came from practical health concerns or deeper spiritual beliefs, but the archaeological evidence is clear. Vikings took their appearance seriously. You probably won't survive hearing this next part without laughing, but Viking romance wasn't just grunting and dragging someone into a longhouse by their braid. These were deeply sensitive, metaphor-loving weirdos who expressed love through poetry and sometimes mild threats. Vikings had an entire tradition of skaldic poetry, a type of verse so dense with metaphor it makes Shakespeare look like a grocery list. And yes, they used it to flirt. A Viking man might compare a woman's hair to sunlit flax, her walk to a swan on the sea, or if things were really heating up, her body to a well-tempered sword. That's not a pickup line, that's cultural seduction. If your poem didn't come with at least 3 obscure nature references, you were doing it wrong. But it wasn't all flowers and fjords. These poems could get graphic, and if a man composed poetry about a woman without her consent, that was considered dangerous. In some cases, illegal. There's an actual law in the medieval Icelandic Gragas Code that banned men from writing nýð, defamatory or obscene poetry. If a man implied a woman had been sexually available when she hadn't, that could result in exile or even death. So yes, in Viking society, writing a dirty limerick about someone's daughter could lead to legal consequences and a duel. Women, by the way, didn't just stand there blushing. They were fully capable of composing biting verse in return. If a man's poem was lame, crude, or lazy, she might humiliate him publicly with a retort so scathing that entire families would avoid eye contact at feasts for generations. In one saga, a woman rebukes a man's advance with such poetic finesse that he leaves humiliated and joins a monastery. That's right, she flirted so hard in reverse, he found God. So while Vikings carried swords and axes, the real weapon in matters of the heart was poetry, loaded with metaphors, laced with bragging, and legally actionable if you got too confident. Let's not kid ourselves here. Viking romance wasn't exactly built on rose petals and candlelight. It was more like, your father has 3 goats, I have a strong back, let's make a legally binding agreement. Consent existed, yes, but it had to elbow its way through a crowd of dowries, alliances, and extended family members who all had opinions about your love life. Here's how it usually worked. A man decided he wanted to marry. He didn't go serenading his beloved under the stars. He sent his dad, or his uncle, or his most diplomatic friend to the girl's father to negotiate a deal. Because nothing screams passion quite like your potential future being discussed over mead and sheep valuation. The whole thing was basically medieval Shark Tank, except instead of pitching a business idea, you were pitching yourself as breeding stock. And the woman? She technically had a say. Technically. A freeborn woman could refuse a match, but whether that was honored depended entirely on how much her family needed land, allies, or frankly, to offload an opinionated daughter. Some sagas suggest that a strong-willed woman could turn down a suitor and make it stick. Others suggest she'd better run fast if she tried, because family pressure in a society where winter could literally kill you was intense. Still, the Vikings weren't entirely barbaric about it. A woman who was forcibly married had legal recourse. She could stand before witnesses and declare herself divorced. No paperwork, no court appearances, just 3 public announcements. Basically, the medieval Norse version of, "It's not me, it's you," shouted at a dinner party. You'd literally stand at your front door, or better yet at the foot of your marital bed, and announce to anyone within earshot that this marriage was over. And while abducting a bride might sound romantic in some badly translated sagas, Viking law did frown upon it. Frown, not necessarily stop, mind you. Kidnapping a woman for marriage was illegal, but also occasionally celebrated in poetry. Nothing says mixed messaging like a legal code and a love ballad giving you opposite advice. Then there were concubines, or as Viking law charmingly called them, bed thralls. These were women, often enslaved, who were expected to provide companionship, cooking, and of course, intimate services. Consent in this case was mostly decorative. Historians still argue whether these arrangements sometimes evolved into genuine affection or remained purely transactional, but the power imbalance was undeniable. On the bright side, if a husband wasn't up to the job, emotionally or physically, the wife could leave. Viking women didn't have to suffer in silence. They could suffer loudly, in public, and with legal backup. The process was surprisingly straightforward. Announce your intentions, pack your stuff, and walk out. Your family was expected to take you back, and you kept whatever property you brought into the marriage. When it came to premarital relationships, the Vikings were, let's just say, flexible. Unlike their medieval neighbors who were busy obsessing over chastity belts and writing purity oaths, the Norse took a more relaxed view. In fact, a woman's past experience wasn't necessarily a deal-breaker, unless it involved someone else's husband or a very public scandal involving the neighbor's loft. Being romantically involved before marriage wasn't taboo, it was life. Vikings were practical people. If 2 consenting adults had a relationship, the world didn't collapse into chaos. Families might raise an eyebrow, or both eyebrows if the timing was suspicious, but they wouldn't lock their daughters in towers or start inventing medieval chastity gadgets. Virginity was never treated as a woman's primary value. Women were respected for their skills, their family standing, and yes, their reputation. But that reputation didn't hinge entirely on what they had or hadn't done in the bedroom. In fact, some sagas even praise bold women who went after what, or who, they wanted, especially if they did it with confidence and a strong sword arm. This wasn't just cultural flexibility, it was survival logic. Viking society needed strong partnerships. A woman who could manage a farm, handle trade negotiations, and hold her own in a legal dispute was far more valuable than one with a perfectly untouched romantic history. Life was hard. Winter was longer than a Marvel movie, and practicality usually won over idealism. That said, discretion was still encouraged. While premarital relationships weren't punished, boasting about them could get you into serious trouble. If a man bragged publicly about a past partner and she hadn't consented to the story being told, he could face those same legal consequences we mentioned earlier. Essentially, kiss and tell was considered both rude and, in some cases, illegal. In short, the Vikings respected personal agency, as long as it didn't cause unnecessary drama at the feast. If you thought modern mythology gets weird, just wait until you meet the Norse pantheon, a divine soap opera where shape-shifting, cross-dressing, and dramatic romantic entanglements were just Tuesday. Let's start with Freyr, the god of fertility. Freyr wasn't subtle about his role. He was frequently depicted with, let's say, overwhelming enthusiasm for his duties. His sacred statue reportedly came with anatomically confident features, and his worship involved rituals that celebrated life, love, and very suggestive crops. If you were hoping for a god of modesty, Freyr was not your deity. Then there's Loki, everyone's favorite chaos agent. In one story, Loki transforms into a mare, yes, a female horse, to distract a magical stallion, and it works so well that Loki becomes pregnant and later gives birth to an 8-legged horse named Sleipnir. Somehow, this is treated as a quirky anecdote rather than a cosmic HR incident. The Vikings read this story and thought, yeah, that sounds about right for Loki. In another tale, Thor cross-dresses to infiltrate a wedding feast and recover his stolen hammer. His disguise? A bridal gown and a veil. His plan? Grunt a lot and hope no one notices the bride's suspiciously impressive beard. Spoiler alert, they notice, but the hammer gets recovered and everyone goes home slightly confused but ultimately satisfied with the outcome. Why does any of this matter for our bedtime story about Viking relationships? Because the Vikings didn't view romance, gender, or intimacy as neat little categories with clear boundaries. Their myths were messy, fluid, and gloriously inappropriate by modern Sunday school standards. Many Norse deities and heroes engaged in relationships that would make modern legal scholars spend entire seminars trying to explain the implications. The line between affection and absurdity was thin, and the gods crossed it regularly, usually on horseback. But here's the twist that would make your head spin. These myths weren't seen as shocking or scandalous. They were normal. Fertility, love, trickery, transformation. These were all divine forces operating in the world. The gods behaved badly not because they were evil, but because life itself is complicated, and sometimes your greatest lesson comes from a shape-shifting horse mom. Historians still argue whether these stories reflected actual Viking attitudes toward gender fluidity or were simply entertaining tales, but the evidence suggests both. Viking society had rules, lots of them, but when it came to gender and relationships, those rules were negotiable, flexible, or to put it bluntly, do what you want, just don't get caught looking unmanly while doing it. For Viking men, the worst thing you could be called wasn't a thief, a liar, or even a coward. It was ergi, a word so loaded with implications it could make people duel over it. Being called ergi meant you were passive, submissive, or somehow failed to uphold your manly duties, especially in the romantic department. It wasn't about orientation, it was about dominance and perceived social role. Viking masculinity wasn't defined by who you were with, but by how you behaved. If you were seen as yielding or taking a passive role, you weren't just mocked. Your entire reputation could crumble faster than a poorly built longship in a storm. The social consequences were severe because in a warrior culture, perceived weakness could literally get you killed. Women, on the other hand, had a little more wiggle room in this cosmic game of gender expectations. While the society was absolutely male-dominated, don't worry, it definitely was, women had social and legal rights that would make many medieval European ladies green with envy. They could own land, request divorces, and yes, make their romantic preferences known without facing immediate social destruction. Still, expectations were very real and very enforced. A woman who was too outspoken or assertive might be labeled masculine, which, in a weird Viking twist, wasn't always an insult. Some saga heroines are praised for their sharp tongues and sword skills, but the same traits in a man, if aimed the wrong way, could get him publicly ridiculed or accused of practicing sorcery. That's right, practicing magic, particularly cedar, a kind of Norse ritual often linked with emotion and foresight, was considered unmanly. It was women's work. If a man did it, People assumed he was probably weaving spells, crying, and being suspiciously poetic about his feelings. The irony? Odin, the allfather of Norse gods, was a master of satyr. But apparently when he did it, it was strategic leadership. When you did it, it was shameful behavior. Classic management double standard. In Viking society, sticks and stones could break your bones, but words could literally get you stabbed. Insults weren't just playground drama. If someone questioned your honor, your masculinity, or your performance in the bedroom, you could literally challenge them to a duel. That's right. Say the wrong thing and you might find yourself standing shirtless in the woods at dawn, sword in hand, all because you implied your neighbor Olaf was less than enthusiastic under the furs. At the heart of this was something called soothe, a special category of public insult. If you called someone ergi or rager, both of which roughly translate to unmanly in ways no one wanted to hear, that was grounds for a fight, and not a verbal one. We're talking legally sanctioned combat, sometimes to the death. The legal codes were crystal clear. Certain words were considered so damaging they justified bloodshed. Now, before you assume Vikings were just wildly insecure about their masculinity, remember that reputation was everything. These were small, tightly knit communities where everyone knew everyone else's business. If someone accused you of being weak, cowardly, or the ultimate insult, romantically passive, it wasn't just personal. It was social career suicide. Your ability to trade, marry, form alliances, even eat at the good table during feasts, all of it depended on maintaining your honor. And it worked both ways, which is the really interesting part. If you hurled an accusation and couldn't back it up in a duel or court proceeding, you could be the one facing exile. So people chose their insults carefully, like selecting the perfect weapon. When they didn't choose carefully, well, someone ended up bleeding next to a fjord while ravens circled overhead. Interestingly, these disputes weren't always about what actually happened in someone's private life. Often, they were about perception. Rumors, offhand remarks, a badly timed joke at a feast, all could trigger absolute chaos if they cast doubt on someone's masculine identity or social status. The truth mattered less than what people believed, which created this fascinating social dynamic where image management was literally a matter of life and death. Historians still argue whether this honor-based system actually reflected deep insecurities or was simply an efficient way to maintain social order in a warrior culture. The evidence suggests it was probably both, a society that needed to function smoothly while also preparing men for the psychological demands of warfare and leadership. In short, Viking society had absolutely zero chill when it came to trash talk. But all of this reveals something deeper about how intimacy and public image were linked. A man's romantic reputation was tied directly to his social strength and political influence. If you were mocked for being passive, delicate, or losing control in intimate situations, you didn't just lose face. You lost credibility in every other area of life. And once that credibility was gone, good luck keeping your seat at the feast, your voice in the thing, or your standing in the community. This created enormous pressure to project confidence and dominance, especially if that wasn't your natural inclination. In Viking society, love and marriage were all well and good until someone got caught with the neighbor's spouse. Then things got loud, legal, and occasionally bloody. Let's start with the basics. Adultery was frowned upon, but not equally for everyone. If a married woman was caught being unfaithful, that was serious business. Her husband could divorce her, shame her publicly, or depending on the insult to his honor, take up his sword and negotiate with the other man, directly. In extreme cases, the lover might end up significantly less alive than when he arrived at the rendezvous. This wasn't necessarily legal murder. It was more like justifiable homicide due to honor violation, which Viking law treated as a completely different category of violence. Now, if a man was faithful to his wife, well, it depended. Sleeping with an unmarried woman wasn't usually a huge scandal, especially if she was of lower social status. But if the woman was married to someone else, that crossed a serious line, particularly if her husband had a temper or a lot of brothers with swords and grudges. And here's where it gets spicy. If a wife found out her husband was cheating, she could take legal action and divorce him. Viking women had real options in these situations. In fact, sagas tell of wives who calmly packed up their belongings, declared the marriage over in front of witnesses, and walked off, sometimes taking the farm, the kids, and the goats. The Norse legal system didn't just rely on whispered accusations when it came to adultery cases. If you claimed someone committed adultery, you had to prove it. This usually involved catching them in the act or gathering witnesses, which, as you can imagine, made for some very awkward family dinners and extremely uncomfortable social gatherings. Picture trying to enjoy your mead while knowing that half the people at the table had been recruited to spy on someone's love life. And while physical consequences weren't always legally sanctioned, let's just say that Viking vengeance culture didn't require a permission slip from the local authorities. If someone dishonored your household, it wasn't shocking to respond with a broken door, a burned barn, or a suspiciously timed hunting accident where arrows seemed to find their way into backs rather than deer. But despite all the risks, legal, social, and physical, people still cheated. Humans are remarkably consistent like that. The sagas are full of stories about passionate affairs, secret meetings, and elaborate schemes to avoid detection. Some of these tales are so dramatic they make modern soap operas look restrained. Ultimately, Viking adultery laws were less about morality and more about honor and property. Who got shamed, who got stabbed, and who got the livestock afterward. That's what really mattered. The legal system was designed to protect social stability and male honor, not necessarily to ensure everyone's emotional fulfillment. So no, adultery didn't come with scarlet letters sewn onto your clothing. It came with lawsuits, duels, and the occasional goat-related custody battle. Viking romance didn't always rely on charm, poetry, or a strong jawline. Sometimes it relied on magic, specifically a mysterious practice called seder, pronounced seder, which was part sorcery, part spiritual therapy, and part "my ex won't return my runestones." Seder was used for many things: predicting the future, cursing enemies, influencing the weather, and occasionally manipulating love and desire. If your affections weren't being returned, a well-placed spell might just make someone suddenly think you were the most desirable human this side of Valhalla. Coincidence? Never. The magic was real, the results were obvious, and the gods were clearly on your side. But here's the twist that would make your medieval mind spin. Seder was considered a feminine art. Women practiced it openly, often as respected volur or shamans who commanded serious social authority. Men practicing cider? Not so much. A man dabbling in seder risked being labeled unmanly, not because of the magic itself, but because he was seen as performing women's work, which Viking masculinity handled about as well as a longship handles icebergs. There's even a saga where Odin, the literal king of the gods, is called out for using seder. His enemies basically say, "Wow, great spell work there, Allfather." Very mystical. Also, you're kind of embarrassing the rest of us with this feminine magic business. Odin, to his credit, doesn't care. When you've got one eye, an 8-legged horse, and pet ravens, public opinion just doesn't sting the same way. As for the love magic itself, it ranged from harmless charms to full-blown enchantments. Think, drink this herbal tea and fall madly in love, mixed with, and if you don't, something unfortunate might happen to your cows. The Vikings never did anything halfway, including their approach to magical romance intervention. Of course, there were risks. If you were caught using magic to win someone's affection, especially without their consent, it could backfire both legally and supernaturally. People believed that misused magic could rebound like a badly carved boomerang, and you really didn't want your love spell turning into a village-wide outbreak of emotional confusion. Historians still argue whether these magical practices were taken literally or served more as psychological tools for building confidence, but the archaeological evidence suggests Vikings took their spells seriously. Love amulets, runic inscriptions, and ritual objects have been found throughout Scandinavia. Still, for those with a little courage and a bag of herbs, cedar offered options when conventional romance failed. Not everyone could write epic love poetry that would be remembered for centuries, but anyone could try a charm and hope the gods were listening and in a good mood. Modern romance thrives on ambiance, dim lighting, candles, carefully curated Spotify playlists. Vikings, on the other hand, had firelight, the sound of livestock snoring, and 6 relatives pretending not to notice anything happening 3 feet away. Let's talk about privacy, or more specifically, the complete and utter lack of it in Viking households. Viking homes were longhouses, big open buildings where entire families lived, worked, ate, and yes, slept together. Not in a weird way, but in a we're trying not to freeze to death during the endless winter kind of way. The whole clan, parents, grandparents, children, workers, and sometimes a goat or two, shared the same space. Walls were optional, curtains were luxuries, and personal space was a concept that had not yet arrived in Scandinavia. So when it came to intimacy, you didn't exactly sneak off to a cozy private suite with rose petals and champagne. You maybe rolled over toward the fire, pulled a fur blanket up over your heads, and tried to ignore the sound of Uncle Björn loudly snoring 2 feet away while grandmother stirred the evening stew. Romantic? Not really. Efficient? Absolutely. This lack of privacy didn't stop anyone from living their lives, though. Viking culture was remarkably unbothered by the realities of communal living. People just accepted that intimacy happened, occasionally within earshot, occasionally while someone was stirring porridge, occasionally while the baby was crying and the dog was scratching fleas. It was all part of the natural rhythm of household life. Children were often conceived in these crowded longhouses, and everyone sort of developed a collective skill called strategic pretending. You didn't acknowledge what was going on behind that hanging tapestry. You didn't comment on suspicious sounds. You definitely didn't make eye contact the next morning. You simply stared into the fire and thought very hard about fishing, or the weather, or literally anything else. Now, if you really wanted privacy, you had options. Sort of. Wealthier families might hang additional tapestries or set up temporary dividers, the Viking equivalent of a do not disturb sign. But for the average Norse couple, a little discretion, good timing, and the hope that everyone else was genuinely asleep were the best you could manage. Still, despite the lack of privacy, there was no real shame about physical intimacy. Viking society didn't obsess over modesty the way later Christian Europe did. Physical relationships were natural, necessary, and everyone knew it. They just didn't want to discuss the details while grandma was within earshot, which honestly seems pretty reasonable. Let's talk about contraception, or as the Vikings knew it, hope, herbs, and possibly magic. Now, there's no detailed medical manual from the Viking Age titled How to Not Have Kids When You're Busy Pillaging, but there are clues scattered throughout the archaeological record and saga literature. Based on those clues, it's safe to say they had some idea of how to manage reproduction, or at least slow it down when necessary. First off, Viking women were extremely knowledgeable about herbs, not just for healing wounds or curing fevers, but for managing the likelihood of sudden family expansion. Plants like juniper, mugwort, and wild carrot were known throughout Europe for their possible contraceptive properties. Did they work reliably? Possibly. Did they taste like sadness and regret? Probably. But when your alternative was another mouth to feed during a harsh winter, bitter herbs seemed like a reasonable trade-off. There's also evidence that certain practices like extended breastfeeding were used strategically to delay the next pregnancy. Not exactly romantic pillow talk, but effective family planning. Think of it as the Viking version of natural family spacing, minus the spreadsheets and modern medical understanding. But here's the twist that might surprise you. Viking culture didn't obsess over reproduction the way later religious societies did. Children were valued, yes, especially sons who could fight, and daughters who could form beneficial marriage alliances. But intimate relationships weren't only about making heirs. Pleasure was very much part of the equation, which was remarkably progressive for the time period. Even in the sagas, romantic encounters are described with a surprising amount of realism and acknowledgement of mutual enjoyment. Couples fall in love, grow apart, get bored, divorce each other, and find new partners. That kind of casual acknowledgement of human nature suggests a culture that wasn't fixated on guilt, purity, or rigid reproductive expectations. Just practicality, mixed with genuine affection. Of course, if contraception failed, the responsibility almost always fell on the woman. Men weren't expected to know much about those things. A Viking warrior might be able to sail across a stormy sea using just the stars and a raven for navigation, but ask him how mugwort works, and he'd stare at you like you'd grown a second axe. The gender division of knowledge was pretty clear. Men handled warfare, women handled, well, everything else that kept society functioning. If you've ever wondered whether same-sex relationships existed in Viking society, the short answer is yes. The long answer is yes, but only if you really manage the social optics carefully. The Vikings didn't use our modern terminology for sexuality, but they certainly understood that people sometimes formed close, even romantic bonds with others of the same gender. And while that might seem surprisingly open-minded for an axe-swinging culture, it came with one massive catch: honor. You see, Viking masculinity was built entirely on dominance, not just in battle, but in every area of life, including intimate relationships. If two men were involved romantically, the social fallout didn't revolve around who they loved, but who did what. Specifically, the man seen as taking the passive role could be mocked, shamed, or worse, challenged to defend his manhood in combat. This wasn't about morality in the way we might understand it. It was about social status and perceived strength. A man could wear furs, braid his beard with silver, and serenade his best friend with emotional poetry while gazing deeply into his eyes, and still be completely admired by society. But if someone implied he wasn't the dominant force in his private life, that could destroy his reputation faster than a leaky longship in a North Sea storm. There are even saga accounts of men being accused of such things, and then demanding duels to defend their honor. Because clearly, nothing says, "I'm definitely the alpha," quite like fighting someone at dawn with swords because of a rumor about cuddling. The logic was ironclad. If you're strong enough to kill a man over an insult, you're obviously not the submissive type. And what about women in same-sex relationships? Honestly, they got far less attention in the legal texts, likely because their relationships weren't seen as threatening to the social order in the same way. Two women together didn't challenge male dominance, didn't produce inheritance complications, and didn't mess with the all-important masculine ego that held Viking society together. So, while we don't have extensive direct evidence, it's entirely possible that such relationships existed and were quietly accepted, or at least politely ignored by the community. As long as women fulfilled their expected social roles, managing households, raising children, maintaining family alliances, what they did in their private time was considerably less regulated. Interestingly, the Norse gods didn't care much about gender categories at all. Loki, as we've mentioned, had children in both male and female forms, and no one in Asgard batted an eye. The divine realm was fluid, shape-shifting, and gloriously unconcerned with human social conventions. It was just the humans who needed everything to fit neatly into a saga-friendly narrative structure. If you thought Viking marriage was all about long feasts, exchanged swords, and blood oaths sworn under the northern lights, you might be surprised to learn how casually it could end. Because in Viking society, divorce wasn't some drawn-out legal drama requiring years of court appearances and expensive lawyers. It was more like, "I'm done. I'm taking the ox. Good luck with your life." Seriously, Viking women could divorce their husbands without needing permission from a judge, a priest, or even a ceremonial raven. All they needed was a clear voice and a couple of witnesses to make it official. Here's how the process worked. A woman could end her marriage by standing in front of a group of people, preferably at the front door of the house or beside the couple's bed, yes really, and declaring loudly and clearly that she was leaving. Bonus points if she could name specific reasons for leaving, like abandonment, violence, or the classic complaint, "He won't stop reciting bad poetry during intimate moments." And that was IT. Once the declaration was made in front of witnesses, the marriage was considered dissolved. No waiting periods, no mediation sessions, no custody battles dragged through 3 harsh winters. Property and children would then be divided, usually according to pre-existing social customs or agreements made during the original marriage negotiations. It wasn't always clean or fair, but it was shockingly efficient by medieval standards. No paperwork, no bureaucratic delays, no having to explain your personal business to a room full of judgmental officials. What's more, Viking women often walked away from failed marriages with their dowries intact, and in some cases kept control of land or valuables they'd brought into the union. Divorce didn't automatically make a woman a social pariah or economic dependent. In fact, many divorced women remarried successfully, especially if they were wealthy, skilled at managing households, or the kind of person who could wrestle a goat without flinching. Of course, not all separations were peaceful and civilized. Some involved dramatic accusations, family feuds, and the occasional saga-worthy exit scene. But even then, the culture generally accepted that sometimes people just moved on. The gods themselves were chaotic and unpredictable in their relationships, so why should human romance be any different? It's also worth noting that men could initiate divorce using the same basic method, though their reasons usually involved complaints about lack of obedience or failure to fulfill wifely duties. Which probably tells you everything you need to know about male expectations in Viking marriages. Still, the process was equally straightforward. Stand up, announce your intentions, and start dividing the livestock. If you think modern weddings can get weird with their destination ceremonies and elaborate themed receptions, wait until you hear what the Vikings were doing with their goat sacrifices, bridal swords, and extremely awkward bedroom rituals. Viking weddings weren't just a party. They were a political merger, a legal contract, and a community event where everyone had strong opinions and even stronger smelling fish dishes. The festivities could last up to a week, depending on how wealthy or dramatic the families involved were. Think of it as Game of Thrones meets a medieval county fair, with fewer dragons but significantly more passive-aggressive toasts about dowry negotiations and property rights. The bride and groom each had symbolic preparations that would make modern wedding planners weep with confusion. The bride had her hair unbraided, a sign of maidenhood ending, and sometimes wore a brúðarhúfa, a special headdress if her family was feeling extra mythological. The groom, meanwhile, might retrieve his ancestral sword from the family collection, because nothing says "I'm ready for lifelong commitment" quite like brandishing a weapon at your future in-laws. But here's where things get very, very Viking. The consummation wasn't just encouraged, it was mandatory. And in some regions, it had to be witnessed. Yes, you heard that correctly. Witnessed. In some cases, a few unfortunate relatives stood by the door with torches in hand to make sure the couple actually sealed the deal and didn't just pass out from mead consumption and pre-wedding nerves. Why this invasive tradition? Because Viking marriage wasn't about love. It was about validating a legal and economic contract. Marriage affected inheritance rights, land ownership, political alliances, and family honor. So if you didn't follow through with the physical consummation, someone might challenge the legitimacy of the union later, leading to lawsuits, blood feuds, and very awkward family gatherings for generations. That's how you end up with distant cousins arguing over property rights while pointing to your wedding night performance as evidence. Much simpler to just have a few witnesses awkwardly nod from outside the curtain and hope for minimal eye contact the next morning over breakfast porridge. Of course, not every wedding was quite that dramatic or invasive. In less theatrical communities, the consummation was simply assumed to happen, or at worst, verified through loud bragging the next morning over the communal stew. But the underlying principle remained the same. Marriage was a public institution with public consequences, so privacy was negotiable. There were also beautiful rituals involving hammers blessed by Thor, shared drinking horns filled with specially brewed ale, and solemn oaths sworn before witnesses under the open sky. In fact, the term honeymoon originally referred to drinking honey mead for a full moon cycle after the wedding to boost fertility and ensure the union would be blessed with children. Romantic and slightly sticky. Historians still argue whether these elaborate wedding customs reflected genuine spiritual beliefs or were simply practical ways to ensure social contracts were properly witnessed and legally binding. By now, you've probably realized that Viking intimacy wasn't all pillaging and grunting in smoky longhouses. It was layered, strategic, wildly poetic, slightly magical, and occasionally performed next to livestock with very strong opinions about the proceedings. Viking culture didn't treat physical relationships as something shameful or hidden away like a guilty secret. It was simply a part of life, like farming, raiding, or wondering if your neighbor was plotting revenge over that borrowed axe you never returned. Intimate relationships served purposes both sacred and practical, producing heirs, forging political alliances, settling family scores, and sometimes just getting through a very long winter when the only entertainment was storytelling and whatever passed for board games in medieval Scandinavia. Passion absolutely existed, but it came tangled up in reputation, legal obligations, family honor, and community expectations like a particularly complicated fishing net. You didn't just fall in love and ride off into the sunset. You made sure your great-aunt approved, your livestock were properly accounted for, and 3 sword-carrying uncles had given their blessing. Romance wasn't a private affair between 2 people. It was a group project involving extended family, tribal politics, and occasionally the local thing assembly weighing in on whether your relationship choices were socially acceptable. The sagas themselves, those sweeping epic tales that have survived for over 1,000 years, are absolutely full of love, jealousy, clever women outwitting powerful men, and emotionally unavailable heroes brooding dramatically by fjords. Some stories end in elaborate weddings with week-long celebrations. Others end with one partner sailing off into the fog while the other stabs a cousin for looking smug at exactly the wrong moment. Either way, it's pure drama. Beautiful, wind-swept, emotionally messy Norse drama. And through it all, Viking women weren't passive background characters waiting to be rescued or married off. They seduced, divorced, cursed their enemies, negotiated business deals, and occasionally set things on fire when diplomacy failed. They were respected for their wit, feared for their magical abilities, and occasionally remembered in verse, which in Viking terms was basically the ultimate compliment, since poets were the closest thing they had to social media influencers. Even their gods treated love like a battlefield where anything could happen. Loki transformed genders whenever it suited his purposes. Freyr paraded his fertility like a prize-winning agricultural display, and Odin dabbled in romantic magic without blinking an eye or worrying about his masculine reputation. The divine realm set the tone for human behavior. Love was powerful, unpredictable, and definitely not rated for general audiences. So what was intimacy really like for the Vikings? It was communal when you wanted privacy, poetic when you expected grunting, and legally complicated when you hoped for simple romance. It could win you honor or get you exiled from your community. It was public in all the wrong moments and surprisingly progressive in all the right ones. And perhaps most Viking of all, it wasn't about being perfect or following some idealized romantic script. It was about surviving love with your pride intact, your farm still functioning, and your sword arm ready for whatever came next. Because when the Norse did love, they did it like everything else in their lives, with fire, dramatic flair, and absolutely no apologies for making it complicated. If you were a medieval peasant, don't imagine holidays meant sipping wine by a cozy fireplace while someone else handled your daily chores. No, holidays were holy days, religious observances sprinkled generously across the calendar like seeds in a farmer's field. On paper, it might have looked like you got regular breaks from back-breaking agricultural work. In practice, you might still find yourself roped into helping fix the church roof, cooking enormous pots of stew for the entire village, or chasing escaped pigs through the streets during the festivities. Still, it definitely beat digging turnips in frozen ground while your fingers turned blue and your back screamed in protest. The church, bless its medieval heart, gave the peasantry dozens of feast days throughout the year. We're talking Christmas, Easter, countless saints' days, Marian festivals, and random local holidays honoring relics like St. Gertrude's allegedly miraculous toenail, or a splinter from some long-dead bishop's walking stick. These weren't optional suggestions for spiritual reflection. They were sacred timeouts, where you were expected to pause all labor, attend Mass, and ideally spend some time contemplating your sin-soaked soul and the various ways you disappointed God since the last feast day. But peasants, ever pragmatic and creative, found ways to turn these holy days into moments of genuine joy, communal feasting, and barely controlled drunkenness that would make modern party planners weep with envy. Yule, for instance, wasn't just a single day of celebration, but 12. That's 12 whole days of storytelling by the hearth, ale sloshed caroling through village streets, and if you were extraordinarily lucky, someone might show up with an actual roasted pig instead of the usual turnip and hope stew. It was basically the medieval equivalent of a Netflix binge and holiday potluck rolled into one glorious, exhausting celebration. But don't get too comfortable with visions of endless leisure time. While your lord might not expect rent payments or field labor during a feast day, he very well might expect your eldest son to serve wine at his table, your daughter to help dress the lady of the manor in her Saint's Day finery, or your wife to contribute to the communal cooking that would feed half the countryside. Holidays could blur the line between sacred rest and unpaid community service faster than you could say blessed Saint Swithin. Still, there was something deeply communal and genuinely beautiful about these celebrations. These weren't individual spa days or personal vacation time. They were shared rituals where everyone participated together. Everyone in your village would dress in their best clothing, which usually meant their least muddy tunic, and maybe a ribbon that hadn't been chewed by goats. They'd share whatever limited food supplies were available, pooling resources so that even the poorest families could taste meat or white bread occasionally. And for one precious day, people would pretend that life wasn't just endless toil, crushing taxes, and dental problems that would make modern dentists faint. They'd sing together, dance together, tell stories, play games, and create memories that would sustain them through the long, dark months ahead. So yes, medieval peasants definitely had holidays, a surprising number of them actually, which might shock anyone who imagines medieval life as nothing but brutal suffering. But each holiday came with invisible strings attached like a marionette. Attend church services, don't work the fields, maybe help with the annual mystery play, and for heaven's sake, don't get caught skipping mass to take a nap in the hayloft. Unless you wanted a stern talking to from Father Bartholomew and a week's worth of additional penance prayers. Yule, the most magical time of the medieval year, assuming your idea of magic includes dead animals roasting on spits, evergreen branches nailed to wooden beams, and your uncle passed out in a haystack after consuming his body weight in fermented beverages. For medieval peasants, Yule wasn't just one day of celebration. It was 12 long, glorious, occasionally chaotic days between Christmas and Epiphany, where the normal rules of daily life loosened considerably, and even the poorest souls got a genuine taste of festivity. It all began on Christmas Eve when the Yule log, an actual enormous tree trunk, not a chocolate cake shaped like wood, was dragged into the hearth with great ceremony and kept burning throughout the entire season. The ashes from this log were considered powerfully lucky, which made perfect sense because keeping a giant piece of timber ablaze for 12 consecutive days in a medieval house was essentially managing a controlled house fire while trying not to burn down the entire village. Feasting was absolutely central to Yule celebrations, although what counted as feasting varied wildly depending on your family's economic situation and your lord's generosity. If your village had a particularly generous manor lord, you might be blessed with extra portions of meat, barrels of ale, and a communal pig roasting on a spit in the town square. If not, then dried beans, mystery stew made from questionable ingredients, and bread with actual salt sprinkled on top counted as luxury dining worthy of celebration. But you took whatever you could get, and then you sang about it loudly, off-key, and often while progressively more intoxicated as the evening wore on. There were traditional songs, improvised verses about local gossip, and drinking games that would challenge even modern college students. There were also elaborate games, theatrical performances, and the wearing of masks, because nothing says birth of Christ quite like dressing up as a bear and terrorizing your neighbors while making strange growling noises. These traditions carried whispers of much older, pre-Christian customs, remnants of ancient pagan solstice rituals that had been carefully repackaged with Christian branding but never quite lost their wild, primitive energy. Evergreens hanging indoors, for instance, symbolized eternal life in Christian theology, But hanging them inside homes wasn't just decorative. It was believed to ward off evil spirits, malicious fairies, and in peasant logic, the rats that seemed to multiply whenever food was stored for winter celebrations. It was also one of the rare times when normal social hierarchies got temporarily flipped upside down like a carnival funhouse. Some villages appointed a lord of misrule, usually the biggest fool available, often someone known for making jokes and causing harmless trouble, who was given temporary authority to mock the gentry and organize games that would be absolutely unthinkable during regular times. For 12 precious days, the lowest members of society could act like the highest, telling jokes at the expense of their betters, demanding better food, and generally behaving as if the world had been turned completely upside down. Until the calendar flipped back to January 6th, and harsh reality came crashing back down like a thatched roof collapsing under heavy snow. Still, for all its noise, chaos, and occasional nonsense, Yule was genuinely sacred, not just in the religious sense, but in the deeply emotional sense that sustained people through the darkest months. It represented warmth in the brutal cold, light in the endless darkness, and laughter in a world where losing your teeth by age 30 was considered perfectly normal. In those 12 days, peasants weren't just survivors grinding through another harsh winter. They were celebrants, storytellers, singers, and participants in something larger than their individual struggles. And come January 6th, when the festivities officially ended, back to work, of course. The pig bones were picked clean, the ale had gone sour, and your wife was giving you meaningful looks about that barn roof you'd ignored for an entire week while celebrating. If Yule was all about ale, ashes, and staying warm by the fire, May Day was pure flowers, fertility, and definitely not just the agricultural kind. For medieval peasants, the 1st of May wasn't merely another date on the church calendar. It was a riot of color, music, and mischief, celebrated with the kind of reckless joy that only becomes possible when winter has finally ended, and the crops haven't failed yet. The festivities began at dawn when villagers trotted merrily into the woods to gather May, branches, blossoms, and sometimes a bit of romantic scandal to go with them. Young people especially embraced this tradition with enthusiasm, often vanishing into the forest in pairs and returning several hours later looking considerably more rumpled than when they'd left. Village elders might raise their eyebrows knowingly, but no one complained too loudly. After all, a few extra babies born the following February were just part of the natural rhythm of village life. At the heart of the celebration stood the maypole, a tall wooden pole planted ceremoniously in the village green and decorated with ribbons, flowers, and enough obviously phallic symbolism to make a modern anthropologist blush furiously while taking detailed notes. Peasants danced around it in intricate weaves and circles, laughing, sweating, and pretending it wasn't basically a fertility totem left over from much earlier, more openly pagan times when people were less concerned about Christian propriety. The church disapproved, naturally, but not quite enough to actually stop the dancing and celebration. Even Father Bartholomew occasionally found himself tapping his foot to the rhythm while trying to maintain an appropriately stern expression. Music filled the air, drums, flutes, and bagpipes if you were particularly unlucky, and lived in a village where someone actually owned those screeching instruments. There were plays, foot races, wrestling matches, and in some villages, the traditional practice of leaping over bonfires to prove your courage or earn a year's worth of good luck, depending on whether you cleared the flames successfully. And while much of this celebration was deeply symbolic, honoring the rebirth of nature, expressing hope for a successful harvest, celebrating the triumph of life over the death of winter, it was also a rare and glorious excuse to simply have fun without worrying about productivity, moral improvement, or preparing for the next seasonal crisis. Peasants who spent most of the year wearing ragged tunics that had seen better decades pulled out their finest clothing, often still ragged, but with fewer visible holes and maybe some colorful trim that hadn't completely faded. They adorned themselves with garlands of fresh flowers, crowned a May Queen to represent springtime, youth, and beauty, which in practical peasant terms usually meant has most of her teeth and no visible boils or other concerning skin conditions. Unlike the heavily regulated religious holidays, May Day wasn't bound by church bells, scripture readings, or stern sermons about moral behavior. It was older than saints, older than Christianity itself, a festival celebrating the body as much as the spirit, acknowledging that humans were part of the natural world and subject to the same cycles of renewal and fertility that governed everything from crops to livestock. And though the local lord might still extract his usual labor taxes the very next morning, demanding that everyone return to their regular duties of plowing, planting, and paying rent, for that one flower-scented day, even the lowest-born peasant could dance like they ruled the entire meadow and owned every blooming tree in the forest. In medieval Europe, the church calendar was absolutely bursting with saints, and each one came with their own designated feast day. You'd think that meant endless parties and constant celebration, and technically, yes, that's exactly what it meant. But imagine celebrating your great-aunt Mildred's birthday every other day of the year, except great-aunt Mildred is also a martyred nun who died of gangrene, and her birthday party involves mandatory church attendance and theological discussions about miraculous healing. Welcome to the divine chaos of medieval saints' days. Peasants genuinely loved saints' feast days, though not necessarily for deeply theological reasons. They loved them because feast days provided legitimate, church-sanctioned excuses to stop plowing fields, start eating better food, and begin drinking alcohol before noon without anyone questioning your life choices or work ethic. These celebrations often included a solemn village mass, followed by hours or even days of decidedly less solemn merrymaking. Think religious processions carrying sacred relics, mystery plays performed in the mud by semi-talented villagers, barrels of ale cracked open with ceremonial enthusiasm, and inevitably that one barefoot guy shouting about St. Blaise's miraculous fishbone removal powers while waving a cup of mead and stumbling through the crowd. Each village typically had its own favorite patron saint, chosen for practical rather than spiritual reasons. Some communities chose sensible ones like Saint Isidore for farmers, Saint Apollonia for people suffering from toothaches, or Saint Christopher for travelers. Others went with obscure local legends like Saint Ethelbert of Nowhere, who allegedly cured both leprosy and persistent hiccups with equal divine efficiency. Whoever the saint, their feast day involved honoring their memory through elaborate rituals, communal prayers, and quite possibly roasting a goat if the village treasury could afford such extravagance. If your town was lucky enough to possess an actual saint's relic, a finger bone, a scrap of clothing, or an item dubiously labeled St. Agnes' actual eyeball, the feast day became a full-blown festival that could attract visitors from neighboring villages. Pilgrims might arrive seeking miraculous healing. Merchants would set up temporary stalls selling religious trinkets and questionable relics, and local theater groups would stage dramatic renditions of the saint's life story, often mixing genuine spiritual inspiration with accidental comedy, collapsing stage props, and at least one actor forgetting his lines at the crucial martyrdom scene. The absolute best part of Saints' Days? You didn't have to work in the fields. At least, not the back-breaking agricultural labor that defined most peasant existence. You might still be asked to help with decorations, play trumpet badly in the religious parade, or fetch water for the communal feast, but it wasn't the kind of sunrise to sunset toil that left you collapsing into bed each night, wondering if your spine would survive another season. Of course, the church kept a very watchful eye on these celebrations to make sure they didn't get too out of hand. Too much wine, too much dancing, too many jokes about local authority figures, and suddenly what began as a pious religious event risked devolving into a full-blown peasant rave, complete with improvised songs about the parish priest's questionable Latin pronunciation. Still, most clergy understood that joy, even messy, muddy, slightly blasphemous joy, was infinitely better than despair and social unrest. And if singing slightly off-color songs about St. Bridget while sloshing ale around kept village morale high and prevented actual rebellion, then so be it. A happy peasant was a productive peasant, and productive peasants paid their taxes and tithes without causing political problems. Before Lent arrived, that 40-day joy vacuum of fasting, intense praying, and pretending you hadn't just eaten cheese behind the church when no one was looking, came Carnival. And for medieval peasants, it was the one magical time of year when chaos wasn't just allowed, it was actively blessed by religious authorities. Carnival, also known as Shrovetide, was the season of completely sanctioned misrule and social inversion. Think of it as the medieval version of spring break, except with significantly more turnips in the food and fewer regrets about questionable life choices. Actually, scratch that last part. There were definitely regrets, just different kinds involving farm animals and questionable costume decisions. Carnival kicked off right before Ash Wednesday and functioned as a crucial spiritual pressure valve for the entire community. If you were about to spend weeks living like a monk, eating bland food, avoiding meat, and focusing intensely on your spiritual shortcomings, you absolutely had to party like a complete heretic first. It was practically a religious obligation to sin enthusiastically before the season of repentance began. Masks came out from wherever people had been storing them all year, often grotesque or animal-like creations that allowed peasants to become something entirely different for a few precious days. Devils, kings, talking pigs, mythical creatures, and occasionally very unflattering caricatures of local authority figures. People cross-dressed with abandon composed rude songs about the nobility that would normally result in serious legal consequences, and staged mock parades where the village idiot was ceremoniously crowned king of fools and given temporary authority to issue ridiculous proclamations. For once in their lives, the rigid line between lord and laborer was not just blurred, it was hilariously, dangerously erased. Servants could mock their masters, the poor could ridicule the rich, and everyone could express frustrations that had been building up all year through elaborate theatrical performances and sanctioned social chaos. The food during Carnival was absolutely insane by normal peasant standards. You had to consume all the fat, meat, dairy, and rich foods you wouldn't be allowed to touch during Lent. That meant pancakes if you could afford flour, sausages if you could catch something worth turning into sausage, and butter-soaked everything, assuming you could get your hands on such incredible luxuries. It was literally a last hurrah for your taste buds before Lent arrived, to remind everyone they were dust, ash, and probably going to hell for enjoying themselves too much. There were games too. Peasants hurled flour bags at each other with gleeful accuracy, staged mock battles in muddy fields using vegetables as weapons, and occasionally attempted to ride farm animals like noble war horses, which resulted in exactly the kind of chaos and minor injuries you'd expect from drunk peasants trying to joust while mounted on confused pigs. One particularly popular event was the peasant joust, where two enthusiastically intoxicated villagers would charge at each other with cabbages tied to the ends of long sticks. The winner earned absolutely nothing except bruises, bragging rights, and the admiration of equally drunk spectators cheering from the sidelines. And while the church officially frowned upon the wilder elements, the lewdness, the mischief, the occasional chicken theft that seemed to happen during every celebration, they also knew better than to actually cancel Carnival entirely. It wasn't just fun and games. It was essential catharsis for a population that spent most of the year grinding through difficult, often hopeless circumstances. Carnival was the one time when peasants could completely invert their world, laugh at the powerful mock social conventions, and feel, even briefly, like masters of their own fate, rather than victims of circumstances beyond their control. It was revolutionary theater disguised as religious celebration, a safety valve that prevented real social explosions by allowing controlled ones. Then came Ash Wednesday, and everything changed overnight. The masks were ceremonially burned, the wild music stopped abruptly, and the world went unnaturally quiet. Meat vanished completely from peasant tables, church bells tolled solemnly throughout each day, and the same villagers who danced half-naked around bonfires just 2 days earlier now knelt quietly in church, looking appropriately solemn and hungry while receiving ashes on their foreheads. But the memory of Carnival lingered like smoke from those burned masks, a powerful reminder that joy and freedom were possible, even if they were temporary. It was proof that life contained more than just suffering and submission, that laughter could triumph over hardship, and that wine, when available, should definitely be savored while it lasted. What do you get when you mix religious education, live theater, and a troupe of semi-literate farmers with a genuine flair for dramatic performance? Mystery plays, the blockbuster entertainment of the medieval world. Long before Netflix, TikTok, or even Shakespeare was writing his famous tragedies, peasants gathered in village squares to watch their own neighbors reenact biblical stories in full costume, often performed on wooden wagons that rolled through town like ancient mobile theaters. Mystery plays weren't mystery in the modern sense of crime thrillers or detective stories. The term came from ministerium, the Latin word for craft or guild, since local trade guilds were typically responsible for producing these elaborate performances. So the Baker's Guild might dramatically perform the Last Supper with actual bread as props, while the butchers enthusiastically took on the crucifixion scene, naturally using real pig's blood for maximum authentic gore and audience impact. These plays were performed during major feast days and religious festivals, transforming public squares into makeshift theaters where villagers flocked in their muddiest boots and finest clothing to watch scenes from Genesis, Exodus, or Revelations acted out by people they knew personally. The local blacksmith playing Moses, the miller's wife as the Virgin Mary, and inevitably someone's teenage son hamming it up as a particularly dramatic angel. Some traveling productions moved through towns on decorated wagons, with each wagon staging a different biblical scene, like a divine parade of religious drama. Picture a slow-moving procession, where you could watch the creation, the flood, the nativity, and the resurrection all in one afternoon, performed by people whose day jobs involved shoeing horses and grinding grain. The performances weren't always, shall we say, theologically accurate or particularly reverent. Noah's wife might be portrayed as a nagging shrew who absolutely refuses to board the ark until she finishes her beer and says goodbye to all her gossipy friends. Devils dressed in red tights would chase sinners through the crowd to howls of delighted laughter from children and adults alike. And when King Herod delivered his fiery monologue about massacring innocents, it often ended with audience members enthusiastically chucking vegetables at his head while shouting helpful suggestions about his acting technique. The line between piety and peasant comedy was remarkably flexible, and everyone seemed perfectly comfortable with this blend of sacred and silly. But these plays weren't just entertainment for people with limited recreational options. They served as crucial education for a population that couldn't read and found Latin church services about as comprehensible as bird songs. Mystery plays made the stories of Scripture tangible, emotional, visual, and genuinely memorable. A man in an actual crown of thorns screaming convincingly in agony during the crucifixion scene? That stuck with you far more powerfully than a dusty scroll read in an incomprehensible language by a priest you could barely see from the back of a dark church. Plus, these productions brought entire communities together in ways that required genuine cooperation and shared effort. They needed costumes sewn by local women, props built by village craftsmen, scripts memorized by people who usually communicated through gestures and simple phrases, and coordination that involved everyone from children to grandparents. Even if the angel forgot his lines completely, St. Peter's fake beard caught fire from a stage torch, or the whale that was supposed to swallow Jonah looked suspiciously like a painted cow, it was still a holy mess that belonged entirely to the community. These weren't professional productions imported from distant cities. They were homegrown spectacles created by and for the people who would remember them for years afterward. Historians still argue whether mystery plays were primarily religious instruction or popular entertainment, but the evidence suggests they successfully managed to be both, creating a form of cultural expression that educated, entertained, and unified communities in ways that purely academic or purely frivolous activities never could. In medieval peasant life, a wedding wasn't just a personal affair between two people who happened to love each other. It was the village's biggest legitimate excuse to throw the most elaborate legal party they could possibly get away with. Technically, marriage was a holy sacrament blessed by God. Spiritually, it was a public contract involving property, inheritance, and political alliances. Practically, it was a festival where the ale flowed freely. Everyone danced until their feet bled, and half the guests stumbled home wearing someone else's cloak and carrying mysterious items they couldn't remember acquiring. For peasants, marriage was at least as much about social duty and economic necessity as it was about romance or personal preference. Families arranged unions primarily for land consolidation, additional labor, or livestock acquisition. The bride's dowry might include a pig, several sacks of barley, or a decent-looking goat that hadn't shown signs of disease. Love was optional and considered a pleasant bonus. Breeding strong sons who could lift a plow and work fields from dawn to dusk? Absolutely mandatory and the primary point of the entire enterprise. The festivities began with a simple church ceremony that was usually brief, conducted outdoors right at the church door, and required witnesses to make everything legally binding. Don't expect elaborate choirs and organ music. You might get a single-stringed fiddle if you were extraordinarily lucky, or old Geoffrey attempting to whistle hymns through the gaps where his teeth used to be. After the vows were exchanged and blessed, it was time for the real celebration. The wedding feast that would be remembered and discussed for years. Everyone in the village was invited, which meant neighbors, extended family, distant relatives, and that thatcher who never quite finished repairing your roof, but always showed up for free food. Because hospitality was considered sacred, guests brought whatever contributions they could manage. Bread, eggs, maybe a roasted bird if they were feeling particularly generous or had recently experienced good fortune. The bride's family was expected to provide the bulk of the feast, which sometimes meant boiling a single scrawny chicken in an enormous tub of turnips and proudly calling it wedding stew. But it was shared with genuine joy and gratitude, because most peasants rarely tasted meat except during major celebrations. Then came the dancing. Hours and hours of it, possibly extending for days if the celebration was particularly successful. Medieval peasant dances weren't delicate courtly minuets performed by people worried about their appearance. They were stomping, spinning, mud-slinging affairs where everyone got dizzy. Someone inevitably fell into the fire, and the local musicians played whatever instruments hadn't been accidentally stepped on during the festivities. There were traditional games as well. Jokes about in-laws that would be repeated for generations. Bawdy songs that made grandmothers blush and giggle, and contests ranging from who can drink fastest without falling over to guess how many children the couple will produce before the next harvest. All conducted with the cheerful enthusiasm of people who hadn't experienced this much concentrated fun since the previous May Day celebration. At some point during the evening, the newlyweds would be ceremonially escorted to bed, literally accompanied by the entire village in a tradition called the bedding ceremony. This involved enthusiastic blessings, nervous laughter, and just enough uncomfortable chanting to make the whole experience memorably awkward for everyone involved. Then the curtains were finally drawn, and approximately 9 months later, another village celebration featuring a baptism and renewed speculation about family genetics. Despite the many feast days, festivals, and official holidays scattered generously across the medieval calendar, like seeds in a freshly plowed field, peasants quickly learned a harsh but universal truth. A holy day didn't necessarily mean a lazy day. More often than not, it simply meant different work, performed with slightly more singing and marginally better food than usual, but work nonetheless. Sure, the fields might rest, and the oxen might get a well-deserved break from pulling plows through rocky soil, but that leaky roof still dripped steadily into your cooking pot. The priest's barn still needed sweeping before Mass, and someone absolutely had to cook the communal stew that would mysteriously consist entirely of onions, hope, and whatever vegetables hadn't rotted during storage. Holidays weren't about complete idleness. They were about public service with extra candles and religious justification. Let's say it's St. Swithin's Day, which meant no fieldwork according to church law. Excellent. But now you're being drafted to help construct a flower arch out of dead branches and whatever blooms you can find. Then you're recruited into the annual mystery play as Roman soldier number 3, whose only dramatic responsibility is to yell, "Blasphemer!" convincingly and fall dramatically in the mud on cue. Later, you'll find yourself stirring an enormous cauldron in the churchyard while Father Bartholomew hovers nearby, micromanaging your seasoning technique and offering unsolicited theological commentary about the spiritual significance of proper stew preparation. Even the famous 12 Days of Yule weren't pure leisure time for anyone involved. Someone had to gather enormous quantities of firewood to keep those celebratory fires burning, brew the traditional ale that everyone expected to drink, roast whatever questionable meat had been acquired for the feast, and most importantly, maintain the Yule log fire that absolutely could not be allowed to go out early. If that sacred fire died before Epiphany, it was considered a terrible omen, possibly indicating plague, famine, or divine displeasure with the entire community's spiritual condition. No pressure whatsoever. Children and elderly relatives didn't escape these holiday work obligations either. The kids were typically tasked with gathering herbs for cooking, delivering awkwardly shaped loaves of bread to neighboring families, or carrying messages between households. The elderly were expected to position themselves near the hearth and tell traditional stories, preferably ones that didn't end in catastrophic fires, devastating plagues, or goats escaping and terrorizing the countryside. Though, to be perfectly honest, those disaster stories were usually the most entertaining and memorable ones. Some villages developed clever traditions like church cleaning day, which was diplomatically scheduled to coincide with a saint's feast day to make the mandatory labor sound less like a tedious chore and more like a spiritual devotion. And if your local lord decided he wanted a new ceremonial banner sewn before his own feast day celebration, or needed the castle moat cleared of accumulated debris and dead fish, guess who got volunteered for those delightful tasks? Hint, it wasn't the people who could afford to pay others to do manual labor. Of course, there were still genuinely bright spots that made holiday work bearable and sometimes even enjoyable. Work performed on feast days usually came with extra food rations, maybe a precious gulp of ale, and most importantly, the camaraderie of neighbors grumbling together about their shared obligations while secretly enjoying the break from routine. Plus, absolutely nothing built lasting community bonds, quite like collectively hauling a rotting log out of the village pond, while trying not to think too carefully about what had been living in it or how long it had been decomposing there. For medieval peasants, life was undeniably brutal, often hopeless, and filled with challenges that would make modern people weep with despair. But it wasn't entirely joyless or devoid of meaning. In fact, the calendar was surprisingly peppered with enough festivals, holy days, saints' feasts, and village celebrations to give even experienced modern event planners a serious headache and deep respect for medieval organizational skills. These events didn't just provide brief moments of rest from endless agricultural labor. They offered crucial structure, spiritual meaning, and a comforting rhythm to lives that were otherwise ruled by mud, backbreaking toil, crushing taxes, and the constant threat of disease, famine, or violence from traveling bandits. Each season brought its own carefully crafted blend of sacred celebration and social gathering, creating a cycle that sustained communities through the darkest periods. Winter held the precious warmth of Yule with its 12 days of storytelling, candlelit masses that provided both spiritual comfort and actual heat, and communal activities that reminded everyone they weren't facing the harsh months alone. Spring delivered the explosion of May Day festivities, full of fresh blossoms, roaring bonfires, and the kind of blushing faces that disappeared suspiciously behind hedges before returning with grass stains and satisfied smiles. Summer brought the time for elaborate saints' processions, pilgrimage fairs that introduced exotic goods and traveling entertainers, and maybe, just maybe, a feast hosted by the manor lord that didn't taste exclusively like turnip surprise seasoned with desperation and wildly optimistic herbs. These summer celebrations often featured the best food peasants would taste all year, along with entertainment that ranged from skilled minstrels to local farmers attempting juggling with predictably disastrous but hilarious results. Autumn closed the annual loop with harvest festivals that weren't as flashy or dramatic as Carnival or Yule, but carried deep satisfaction and genuine relief. After months of sweating in fields, worrying about weather, and wondering whether the crops would survive long enough to feed everyone through winter, Peasants gathered for communal meals that celebrated not just survival, but the possibility of actual prosperity. There was dancing, ale consumption, and the roasting of things that probably shouldn't have been roasted, but no one complained because protein was protein, and gratitude made everything taste better. Even the fasting seasons, like Lent and Advent, were integral parts of this sustaining rhythm. They made the feasting periods sweeter and more meaningful, the celebrations more profound and spiritually significant. And while the church leadership might have hoped peasants would spend those solemn days in quiet, contemplative repentance, most people simply switched their usual complaints about hard work and poverty to grumbling about thin broth and religious obligations, until the next excuse for celebration rolled around like a blessed wagon full of ale and hope. The joy wasn't located solely in the grand celebrations themselves, but also in the anticipation, the planning, and the preparation that filled the weeks beforehand. Planning a mystery play meant villagers working together, sharing ideas, and creating something memorable. Brewing ale for Yule required cooperation, shared knowledge, and the kind of community effort that strengthened social bonds. Even sewing ribbons into old tunics for May Day represented acts of hope and creativity that reminded people they were more than just agricultural labor units serving their social superiors. These activities gave peasants something precious to look forward to, a light at the end of each seasonal tunnel, a reason to keep going when everything seemed pointless. They provided chances to feel genuinely alive, connected to something larger than individual suffering, and part of a community that cared about shared joy as much as shared survival. And that, perhaps, represents the real miracle of the medieval festival calendar. It managed to stitch together a world that existed constantly on the edge of illness, invasion, famine, or complete social collapse, with moments of pure laughter, communal music, and collective relief that made endurance not just possible, but meaningful. Whether people were dancing enthusiastically around a maypole, falling spectacularly off a pageant wagon during a mystery play, or burning their fingers on Yule logs while trying to keep sacred fires alive, peasants discovered ways to celebrate both the absurd and the divine with equal enthusiasm. In the end, they didn't need luxury, exotic spices, or elaborate entertainment imported from distant cities. They just needed time, community, and legitimate reasons to lift their cups and shout with genuine feeling. Blessed saint, whoever you are, we actually made it through another year of this impossible existence. And then they'd drink deeply, sing loudly, and prepare to face whatever challenges the next season would inevitably bring their way. Now, as our journey through these distant worlds of Vikings, peasants, and the stories that shaped them draws to a close, let your breathing slow and your mind settle into the gentle rhythm of sleep. Picture the last embers of a Yule fire glowing softly in the darkness, the final notes of a Viking skald's poetry fading into the northern wind, and the quiet satisfaction of a medieval village after a day of celebration. These people, separated from us by centuries, face their joys and sorrows with the same human hearts that beat in your chest tonight. Rest now, knowing that their stories live on, and that somewhere in the turning of seasons and the cycle of days, we're all part of the same endless, beautiful, complicated story of being human. Sweet dreams.